Hello, you wonderful people, and welcome to another episode of Super-Fanta-Fi. This being a show where we talk about TV shows of the supernatural, fantasy, and or science fictional genre. For today's episode, I'm going to talk about the series premiere of Interview with the Vampire. I always put a there instead of the. A great series premiere. A lot of really interesting things went down in this episode, so let's break it down. So, I might have talked about this before. I don't remember the movie that well. I remember I think Brad Pitt, Tom Cruise, Kristen Dunst. That's about all I remember about the movie. I don't even think I've ever seen it all the way through. I've definitely seen Queen of the Damned all the way through because I went to the theater to see that when it originally came out. Either way, so it's pretty much like watching this show for the first time because there's so many things that I'm like, oh man, it makes sense with the title. It's like, okay, so the story's being told from Louis' perspective. It's him telling his story in retrospect, which I think is an interesting plot device of just how to tell this story because it's like, right, you get the experience the story, but you also have him. Oh, it's I've got a full century plus under my belt that kind of give me perspective on a lot of different things of the inside of how you felt then and who you versus who you are now, and I think that kind of gives a very interesting nuance bit of storytelling. Once again, the title is obvious with that, but it's just like I never really gave it too much thought. Once again, especially because I didn't remember them. Because I'm assuming because the movie came out in the '90s, so I'm assuming that the interviewing and stuff like that happened in the '90s, if it did. Because I know this is all tied into the same books, Interview the Vampire and Queen. I didn't reference them because I know it's from a series of books. So I don't know if this is combining stuff or this is just purely the Interview of the Vampires. I don't know because I've never read the books. Those movies are my only experience, and once again, that's a very limited experience because I don't really remember much. But I really thoroughly enjoyed that type of storytelling. If you don't know, one of my favorite video games is Final Fantasy X. It uses a very similar storytelling device. But either way, it was interesting knowing that Louis and this journalist, Daniel, they've actually tried to do this before back in the 70s, but Louis kind of could have put a huge kibosh on it because Louis didn't like the questions the guy was answering. I love Daniel being like, I was high at the time, so it's just he felt like Louis wasn't giving him all the answers, which Louis even admits, oh, I was kind of a child at the time. It's been, at that point, 50 extra years. So it's like, oh, I've grown and I'm willing to tell my story now. But he never explained, at least at the time, why now. You didn't want to tell your story then. You got upset. We went on this huge break and now it's like, oh, now all of a sudden you want to, and you're getting me to tell your story. Why? And I think that's so fascinating. I also love that the show opened up with essentially a journalist masterclass. I thought that was kind of neat, and it seems like he's someone that's kind of fallen to the way. Well, because it turns out he's sick, and I was curious because the way he was kind of talking to his doctor, I was like, "Oh, is this supposed to be during the pandemic?" Oh, it's super during the pandemic. I mean, they even specified it's June 14th, 2022. During the episode, so it's right with everything kind of going on and. I guess he even said, with the way the state of the world is now and just seeing how things have shifted, I guess he picked this time out of any time to be the one where he decides, I'm going to tell my story and kind of understanding his background. Because obviously, the way they played it in the movie, I would assume is probably closer to the book, obviously Louis being black in this series, and obviously they don't shy away from what that means into it. They do lean into the implications of that. It's right, the only reason why he had any sort of reputation is because his father had a reputation. It's right, and no one else. He's like my father, or or my grandfather or whatever, looked whatever like everyone else. Only difference is they weren't of someone of status, because I think the family business is what's kept, because he was basically being oh, kind of there is no. He's decades of Jim Crow kind of made you go oh, there is no free black man. So, but it's because they worked their way, because the family business was sugarcane, but, after his father died after a couple years, he shifted it into a pimping business. And it's okay. I love that whole alderman situation bit where it's he's damn it, Brick. She's I'm sorry, but he tried to stick it in my shithole. And I told him to stop, and he didn't. So I gave him my catfish dinner. And she's like, "Oh, you could check his dick." And he's like, "Who the fuck are you talking to? I'm not going to check another man's dick." And she lifts up his shirt or whatever and show, but also showcasing like Louis isn't above being still looked at. Like you being a black man comes first and foremost, because he was like, "Oh, who you touch me?" Hits him with the hard R. Hits him with not even Negro, the hard R. Am I surprised? It's 1910. No. But then he was like, "Oh, this is my place." He's like, "Oh, I'm sorry, Mr. Duluth." It's like, it's because it's like, right. Once they know who you are, that's when it really resonates. That's when it really matters. But first and foremost, he just sees like a black man trying to help him. So, and once again, he has this reputation. He has this air about him, but it still doesn't change the fact is that people still look down upon him. He even goes to this very specific kind of brothel place to get a visit with one lady in particular, Lily, and he made a whole point of it. This one place, he's like, "I'm basically the only black clientele because everyone else around me there is white." But he's like, and you can always tell people who are from out of town because they look at him, because everyone else there in New Orleans, or at least in this particular place, Storyville, which he's saying like that's the only way and only place him and his family could have the reputation that they have. Any other places, like, no. But here, they're able to kind of run things and kind of be a prominent. I just thought that was just kind of interesting how they really kind of showed you like how things work and how he kind of moves and presents himself. Kind of, it is that ultimate thing of almost like there is this air of Louis kind of always being reminded, yes, I am a black man, even though I have to kind of act like I'm walking amongst them, like we are on equal terms. But still you can tell. I mean, I don't think it's just the times with just the way, the manner in which he says, "Oh yeah, Mr. Anderson, sir," saying all that. It's like, no, because regardless of anything, he's still a black man in his time, so he has to be careful in which the way he talks to people. So it could just be this said at a time, but I feel like the sir thing is still a thing of being aware of your place, but still thinking like you still have some monochrome of respect from these people, but it's like, no, you'll always be, especially because later on it's like, oh, the alderman has this idea, and it's like, oh, what do you think about the business idea? It's like, cool, I said he should give you like 10%. He's like, 10%, and the alderman's like 15, and he's like, Louis, the guy's putting in all the money and just you're the labor. But that's for Louis. It's like, yeah, but I'm doing all the work and I'm only going to get 10% of it. He's like, how, that's not really fair. So it's just a stark reminder of just like, yeah, that probably would have been even more of an issue, because once again he has to play nice, because he can't step too out of line, because that's too much of an issue, So he has to play the game, still has to kind of softball it a little bit. Probably doesn't get to speak in the manner he would want to. Either way, because I think what's also interesting too is kind of, circling back to the family dynamic of it all. First and foremost, like his family's okay with it, but even he recognizes, yeah, they are only okay with it because of the money that is bringing in. But the difference is my brother Paul is very vocal about it, but that's also because his brother Paul is kind of not well in the head. And I think that in conjunction, like religion is kind of like the thing he focuses on. And I think it kind of, religion ends up being the, what's the word I'm looking for? The sort of, I don't know what the word is I'm looking for. It ends up being kind of the, I want to almost say like Avatar, but it ends up being this thing that his condition kind of focuses on, and then it ends up being because obviously he's against his brother's business. He's even there. They're trying to kind of save the souls of the ladies, even to the point that Louis had to pull a blade out on his brother, and it's like, I didn't want to do that. He's like, I love my brother. On his brother's good days, it's like, yeah, that's like his best friend. He loves Paul more than anyone in the world, but it's like when he has his bad days, that's when it's an issue. But either way, his introduction to Lestat I thought was kind of interesting. It was kind of like them both trying to basically, it was a dick measuring contest over Lily, both trying to keep her company, and for Louis, he's like, I wanted to put my blade and slice this dude's throat, but he's like, I couldn't. I was kind of paralyzed with cowardice. It's just his stare, it made me stay in my place. And just as like Lestat's like, waxing poetically about things, about why he's here. He was actually going to go to St. Louis, but he decided to stay here. And what changed his mind was keeping an eye on Louis, and even seeing Louis pull a blade on his brother. It's like, oh, like he became captivated, and just showing him up. It's like, oh, I keep wanting to calling him Jacob because I think, if I'm not mistaken, that's the actor's real name. Louis kept putting down money, but Lestat kept putting out more and ended up walking away with Lily. For him, it was the most emasculating thing ever. But at the same time, it's like, in that moment, I always also wanted to be him, So it's like it was kind of anger yet infatuation, kind of like that mix of emotions when it came to Lestat. But he also came to learn, and I think this is such a neat display in this first episode alone of what vampires are capable of in this universe. Obviously, it ranges from different vampire fictions to what vampires are capable of. And maybe it's like a being older thing. Maybe they just all have this ability just as a matter of figuring it out yourself. But Louis was there when he got inside of his head, when Lestat got inside of his head, but also kind of froze time. And for Louis, time felt like it was moving normal for him, but everyone else was kind of frozen. He's like, I never figured out how he did that. And anytime I'd ask him, he's like, oh, don't worry about it, Louis. I'll explain it to you later. Patience, Louis. Don't rush things. So, and I love that while he's getting interviewed by Daniel's like, oh, so he was a vampire. He's like, oh, don't rush the story, Malloy. The fact is that we'll get there in time. Let's go slow, And I guess for a vampire, when, you kind of have eternity, the fact is that a human's right, because humans have such little time, the fact is you want to rush through everything. It's like, nah, take things slow, build it. He was like, I want you to get seduced into the story. So just like I was seduced into being what I am now. So I thought that was kind of neat how Louis kind of played with that in that regard. But I also do like that this episode didn't just, let us learn about Louis. We also did learn a little bit about Lestat, especially when Paul was questioning him at the dinner table and stuff. And it was this whole situation of Lestat talking about the fact is that he actually wanted to be a priest, and he studied, he learned all this stuff, and you could tell in that moment, I couldn't tell if Paul was getting mesmerized just because Lestat doing his thing, or was it because of what specifically Lestat was talking about and referencing that captivated him. The birds in his ear were kind of being swept up by Lestat's words, as he kind of used the birds in his ear are the ones that kind of talked to him and made him ask questions and stuff. But he was saying basically his father did not approve of it, and his father would send him away. He was and in between the beatings, and he's and so if you want an answer to it, he's there is an ocean between me and God. And then, but Louis didn't appreciate Lestat doing his thing to his family. He was no, don't do it here, not on my family. And Paul ended up kind of snapping out of the trance that he was in. But there was also the whole, and I don't know if this is true to the books. I don't really remember the movie, so I don't even know if this is it something they changed specifically for this? Because I get the feeling this is probably going to lean a little closer to the book than maybe the movie was, because the movie had a limited amount of time. This has a full season to kind of tell the story it wants to tell, so that's what I'm curious about. So the whole, because I always kind of remembered, I was oh, wasn't there always kind of this thing between Lestat and Louis? But then they kind of lean into it this one, because it's right, there's the whole Lily thing. He's oh, is that your thing? You want to watch? But then kind of puts Lily to sleep and something happens between them. And for Louis, it is a conversation of being black and being gay at this time. Because he's yeah, I've experimented before, but it was usually in drunken situations. It was never, I don't think it was ever fully conscious and on purpose. This was the first time that it ever happened. And he's yeah, now, he's a struggle for a while. He's even, that's how we met, Daniel, at a gay bar. It's yeah, I know, I remember. But it's he's come more terms with his sexuality. But at that time, obviously, it's that's why he wanted to stay away from Louis, because, that's why Louis wanted to stay away from Lestat, because it was just this, I I can't be that. I can't be that side of myself, especially now. Like, so he wanted to distance himself, like, because Lestat brought that out of him. Because he'd even talked about, he's like, yeah, basically that electrifying feeling. Like, he was talking to Daniel about, like, oh, what was that feeling? He's like, well, magnitude that, multiply it by miles throughout your entire body. And he was like, that was kind of like the experience between Louis and Lestat. And I just thought that was so interesting. And so because of that, he was, I'm gonna keep my distance from him, which Paul was kind of okay with, because he's like, yeah, that guy's the devil. I heard him like whispering to me. And that Paul and Louis thing was so heartbreaking, especially because they did the whole tap dancing. That whole sequence was so beautiful because it's him and his brother. It felt like in that moment, his brother felt more like himself in that moment, like the way he was smiling and just them kind of in the flow of it. Because it was, it was them both doing it for their sister's sake, for her wedding. And it felt beautiful. And them like on the roof with the sunset and everything. It felt, I don't know. And him, Paul saying all the things that he was saying, I felt like he's not going to, right? He's not, there's no way he's going to do what I think he's about to do. And he does, he kills himself. And the heartbreaking thing is, like, Louis gets blamed for it. His mom being like, oh, you always had to be the one that had the last word. It's like they'd always had their back and forth. And his mom, like, would try to calm him down or try to calm Louis down. But it's because this situation led to Paul killing himself. She's like, what was the last thing? What did you say to him? It's like, the last thing he said to his brother was, I love you, baby brother. Like, that's all he said. There was never any, like, disagreement, because it was just like, right, you think that guy, Levy, he's going to love our so like sister with everything inside of him. And it's like, like, that's all that conversation was. And he killed himself just because because the thing is, he was in a facility before, but I think the family made the choice together, but I think Louis in particular decided to take his brother out of a facility. And his sister was like, oh, we should put him in another one, but he's like, no, they're all going to be the same. They're just going to treat him that same way, like, but it's like he needed help. Like, there was no, like, once again, mental health ain't what it was then isn't what it is now, so. And once again, it's just heartbreaking. And even his sister tried to be like, Mom's just needs someone to lash out at. And it's like, she didn't mean what she said. He's like, no, she did. She wouldn't even let him walk her home after, like, the funeral and stuff. It's like, he feels enough guilt, but she just put more on top of him. It's like, yeah, she did need someone to blame, because for her, it's like, it doesn't make any sense. It's like, sad thing is, Paul was sick, And, and it wasn't even like he said anything. Like, they had a beautiful moment together. And I think for him, maybe that was just enough for him to be. I mean, that's also the thing too, because of what Lestat can do. You're like, I don't think he got inside of Paul's head and made him kill himself. But it's like not too out of the realm of possibility. But I think it more. I mean, not unless that ends up being a later reveal. But for now, it could just be like, no, like it simply is. Paul was sick, and that's what ended up pushing him to sadly do that. And the problem is, though, because of that, because of the weight of what his mom put on him, plus him wanting to, like, just get away, drown his sorrows, like, to mourn in peace, to grieve in peace. He's drowning himself in alcohol. He wants Lily as company, because that was the whole thing, like, right, despite everything, it's like, oh, me and Lily just talk. It's like, right, because now we know that, like, that's why he paid for her company, just to talk, because he's not interested in her like that. But it's like, oh, Lily's dead. It's like, oh, Lestat killed her. Which, I should also note, this show, like, when he killed that guy who was turning off the lamps, probably the one jump scare of the episode, simply because, like, I knew it was coming, but it still came so quickly and made me jump, because I didn't know which way he was coming. I was kind of expecting him behind. I wasn't expecting it to be like he comes, like, the way the camera was positioned. I didn't expect him to come from the side like that. So that kind of made me jump. And once again, it's like they're not shying away from the bloodiness of it all. I guess because it is AMC, I kind of forget, like, how, I mean, not bloody, but, like, also, like, the nudity and stuff. I was like, oh, that kind of took me back. But because I guess, like, when I think of that type of nudity, I think HBO, like, Cinemax, Stars, Showtime, like, I think those networks, I kind of forget, like, oh yeah, AMC can push the vein as well, too. I just kind of forget that sometimes. I'm curious I'd have to look at the just regular AMC airing of this, because I'm like, did they cut away from that, or did they censor that, or is that, like, That is it uncensored on AMC Plus, but censored on AMC or what? Because there's stuff they do censor on AMC, so that's what I'm trying to figure out. This might have been like uncensored because it was simply the AMC Plus, so they were able to get away with that. I don't know. But no matter what Louis did, circling back, he could not get away from Lestat. It's just like this, like that voice pounding in his head. The fact is, he's at such a low point that darkness creeping in, and that's why I almost feel like you can't help but feel like he might have had something to do with Paul's death, just so that he could put Louis in a very vulnerable state like that. But once again, we won't really know whether that really fully ends up being the case or not. But that whole sequence at the church, him like giving that monologue of just everything about himself, kind of knowing himself, and it's like, right, he feeling like a failure. He's like, the fact is that obviously he tried to save his family's business. He's like, 4 more months, he was telling Assad like they would have gone bankrupt, they would have lost everything. So he thought he was saving their family. But once again, it's like, he's like, I could tell from the way my mom and my sister look at me. The fact is that they don't really approve of this. They just kind of let it slide because it's the only thing keeping the family afloat, what their father left behind. And he just feels like he's a failure on so many fronts, especially when it came to his brother. And he's like, the fact is, not only did I sleep with a man, but I also I let the devil get inside of my head, and he's beating himself up about it all because he's someone balancing the business that he did and, putting that in conjunction with it put him in a very complicated space with God, essentially. And then Lestat did what he did. And he's like, right, the fact is, that whole sequence was wild, especially when they played with the notion of once again, vampires having super speed. The fact that they showcased it before, how super fast he is. But I love the way they showcase it this time. The other priest is trying to run away, and it looks like he's just moving at normal speed. I'm like, I've said it time and time again. That's why I love the Flash so much. Speedster shit like that, where it feels like the world's moving moving at ant speed around you, and you're just, it seems like you're just going at a normal pace, but everything's at a fraction of a speed. That sequence was amazing just because it didn't even seem like he was running. He was just fast paced walking, and the guy was just moving so slowly. And then the gates close. So once again, kind of hinting okay, so there's telepathy here, there's telekinesis, there's super speed, there's superhuman strength. The fact is, he can make the fire go out, but I'm assuming he was turning the valves to turn the fire off in those lamps, and that's how he was doing that. But the fact is, or rather turning them on. But the fact is that what took me by surprise, I was still like, holy shit, when he stuck his whole damn arm through home dude's face, I was like, holy shit, because I wasn't expecting that. I thought he was going to rip into his throat, not just punch your whole fist to his face. That was wild. Went back to Louis, because it's not Louis could do. Louis stabbed a dude multiple times and it meant nothing. But for him, it's like, Louis, I see you. The fact is, I can see the person you really are. And for Louis, and he even said it, for the first time, he felt seen, because he's like, the sorrow of all, he's like, that's what attracted me to you, because I saw that sorrow in you, that you having to be so many things for so many people, but you can't even be yourself. And it's like, I can free you with death. I can free you from all of this and give you a new life, spend that, that eternity with me by being my companion. Because when he first tasted Louis earlier in the episode, what was it? The little bite or something is what they called it, or the little feed. It's when it takes everything for a vampire to stop feeding, even take a small bite and then stop. But in this case, in the means of transforming him, and once again, transforming, how do you become a vampire changes so much. You take Vampire Diaries, you have to die with vampire blood in your veins. You take something like Rosario plus Vampire, in an anime, in a manga, you basically, a vampire has to inject their blood into you, which it's more traditional, but it's in this case, it's just your traditional, in this case, has to drain your blood to the point of killing you, and then basically having you drink drink a vampire's blood. That's how you become one in the end. So, and for him, it was finally reborn as one. And he was talking about the drums he heard, but he realized, like, right, that drum I was hearing, it was my heart, and in conjunction with him, it's like, and now I was able to see him kind of like the radiance of what he is, the end, the beginning. And in that moment, he cries a blood tear, which I was like, wait, this universe does that too? Because I definitely know that is a True Blood thing. I didn't know that was this series. Well, once again, I don't know how much is them taking liberties with the TV show and how much is what was, kind of hinted at in the movies, what was is actually straight from the book, So I just thought that was so fascinating. I do love that, yes, it's not like immediately getting to everything, but I do like that it is this slow, methodical, like, the point is to make you understand what led to this, that it wasn't just some immediate thing. It wasn't just some action. I mean, just some like random thing of like, oh, I just happened. It's like, no, he even says it. He's like, I didn't even realize it at the time, but I was being hunted. Because from the very beginning, Lestat wanted this. He wanted Louis, and he's like, I love you, and I know you love me back. Which that starts getting into that territory of just kind of like, obviously, like the manipulations and, obviously Louis is going to get complicated here from here because, with any vampire stories, the hunger and what that means to you. The fact is that, he hasn't really even begun to know what this is going to do to his life. Yes, he has a complicated relationship with his family now. Will this be one of those situations where, like, Louis ends up killing his mom and his, sister and his, new brother-in-law, or will he just distance himself from the family and just let them die? Because if his family's still out there, like, that means if he doesn't kill them soon enough, that means he will have family out there that, like descendants, like from his nieces or nephew or whatever children his sister might end up having, like there's going to be descendants on that front that he might still have out there present day, once again, but just for the tragedy's sake of everything, I could just easily see it being like his hunger got the best of him and he ends up killing his mom and his sister and brother-in-law and kind of kills the only family he has left, so just kind of making it, or maybe even Lestat does it just to go like, oh, because he talks about the monster he's become and the vampire being, he's like, the vampire is bored and the human is destroyed. Because being like, kind of, there is no more of that human in him, but maybe that little bit, how much of his humanity got chipped away over the years and how much did he manage to retain? How much did he get back after losing someone? Questions like that. I also really appreciate, I think because it is set in a modern day, they can play with that a little bit more because it's set more modern. Once again, because the movie came out in the 90s, I'm assuming the present day for that movie was the 90s. So for the fact is that Louis has his facility, like, it's like, because Daniel was like, oh, where's your coffin? He's like, this is my coffin. You're standing in it. Like, the fact is that the windows are very specifically made to kind of block out any light, so that, showing like the advancement in technology that he could have he doesn't need like a box to sleep in during the day. He can just have this, it shift, like the glass, it's made with I don't know if it's the same material that you could get like in your glasses that make it so that your glasses tint out. Like, it's probably like that's probably like it on a much smaller scale, but it's probably like a more heavier, like the science behind of like how that works, because it is like tinted glass, but it probably like goes to like even deeper layers of like glass stacked on top of glass. It's probably that same thing of like tinted glasses, but you just make it even further. Like the moment it hits sunlight, your lenses, like, transition, because I had those back in high school or something, or middle school. I had those, so I wonder if it's kind of a similar principle in that regard. Either way, I just thought that was kind of a neat little, like, oh, because of where technology is today, it allows for that. I don't even know if the book touched on that. I would assume the book came out maybe in the 80s or something, just because the movie came out in the 90s. I'd assume the books would have had to been around at least since like at least the 80s, maybe, but maybe not. So I don't know if technology would have been there to kind of reflect that type of thing. So that feels like that is just like a very modern age, like bringing that story in this regard to a even more modern age with that application of his pseudo coffin that he made for himself, or the person that's there that kind of acts as a staffer, I wonder who are they? How did they come into his life? Once again, it makes you wonder, like, could it be like are you just someone he chooses every once in a while? He finds a new person to be kind of his caretaker and a person that kind of helps look after him or handle things for him while it's daylight and he has to be indisposed? Or is it kind of like a family thing of like, oh yeah, like generation after generation, it's been this one family, but it's just new members in each family grow up to serve him in that way? I don't know. Am I thinking too much about it? Most likely, but once again, this is pretty much almost like a introduction to this story for me for the first time because I remember so little about the movie. So I'm very excited to kind of, fully flesh out the rules of all of this thing. Like, once again, how vampirism works in this, especially because there's something else with vampirism coming up soon, which once again has its own rules and circumstances. If you're unaware, I'm talking about the Let the Right One In TV show adaptation that's coming out. I think technically at the end of this week, but really Sunday, whatever the case may be. Well, next Sunday, but regardless. Like I said, either way, I'm excited to see what ends up happening next on Louis' journey as he's explaining things to Daniel and Jess, the bouncing back and forth between present day and past and how we got to where we are today. I think it's just going to be really neat to see. Once again, because I referenced Kirsten Dunst, I do remember that element of the story, and I think I do remember how that ends. So once again, I remember bits and pieces, but like, once again, the journey there is definitely going to be really interesting to kind of, I guess, rediscover to some extent. But either way, that's all I wanted to talk about. Till the next time we meet, be happy, be safe, live life to the fullest, and enjoy it. Good day, and goodbye.